There are concerts Aretha Franklin never gave, stages she never stood on, audiences in London and Tokyo and Sydney who waited for a tour that never came. She could fill any arena in the world. She just couldn't get there. Where did Aretha Franklin's fear of flying come from, and how did a fear she never fully explained end up shaping one of the greatest careers in music history? If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to Soul Legends Untold. Let us know in the comments which legend story you'd like to hear next. In the early years of her career, Aretha Franklin flew without hesitation. She had to. The music industry of the late 1960s ran on movement, city to city, studio to stage, one end of the country to the other, and back again in the time it took other people to pack a suitcase. When Atlantic Records released I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You in early 1967, and the record began its climb toward the top of the charts, Aretha was already on the road. When Respect followed and became something larger than a hit single, became an anthem, a statement, a piece of the cultural air that Americans breathed in the summer of 1967, she was performing it live in cities that wanted to see and hear the woman who had made it for themselves. Those years were extraordinary and relentless. She won the Grammy for Best Rhythm and Blues Recording 4 consecutive times, 1968, 1969, 1970, 1971. She performed at the inauguration of Richard Nixon in 1969, though her relationship with that particular invitation was complicated in ways she expressed clearly in the years that followed. She sang at the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, standing in front of a room full of grief and rage and history, and delivering Precious Lord, Take My Hand with a steadiness that people who were present never forgot. She was, by any measure, the most important voice in American popular music. And she moved through the world the way important voices were expected to move, quickly, constantly, by plane. She had no particular anxiety about flying in those years. Her biographer, David Ritz, who spent years in close conversation with her, noted that the fear did not exist in the early part of her career. She boarded planes the way everyone in the industry boarded planes, without ceremony, without dread, as an unremarkable part of the machinery that kept a touring career running. The airports and the terminals and the hours at 30,000 feet were simply the cost of being everywhere the music needed her to be. The world she was moving through in those years was itself in violent motion. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, the assassination of Robert Kennedy 2 months later, cities burning, the war in Vietnam consuming a generation. Aretha Franklin was not a political artist in the way that some of her contemporaries were. She did not march or organize or deliver speeches, but she was a black woman in America in the late 1960s, and the music she made was received as political, whether she intended it that way or not. Respect became an anthem of the civil rights movement and the women's movement simultaneously, carried into those contexts by listeners who heard in it exactly what they needed to hear. She sang at funerals and inaugurations and benefit concerts. She moved through history at full speed, by plane, without fear. Her personal life during those years was complicated in ways that did not make the newspapers, but left marks nonetheless. Her first marriage to Ted White had ended. She was raising children largely on her own. She was managing the demands of a career that had become so large it required its own infrastructure. Managers, publicists, road managers, musicians, the entire apparatus that surrounds an artist at the top of the industry. She carried all of it and kept moving. The planes were simply part of the movement. That changed in 1984. And it changed in a single afternoon, on a small plane leaving Atlanta. Aretha Franklin had performed at the Fox Theater in Atlanta in 1983.
It was a good show. Atlanta knew her, had always known her, and the Fox was the kind of venue that suited a performer of her stature. Grand and warm at the same time, the kind of room that remembered every voice that had ever filled it. After the show, she boarded a small twin-engine propeller plane for the return flight to Detroit. What happened on that flight she described in a 1993 interview with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with the particular brevity of someone who had learned that detailed descriptions of the thing tended to make the thing feel more present than she wanted it to feel. She said, "I was leaving Atlanta in a very small plane, a two-engine prop plane, I believe, and it was a very bad flight. I'm very much a ground person now." The turbulence was severe. The plane pitched and dropped in the way that small propeller aircraft in rough weather are capable of pitching and dropping, not the gentle shudder of a large commercial jet encountering unstable air, but something more violent, more intimate, more persuasive in its argument that the ground was where human beings belonged. Aretha Franklin arrived in Detroit physically unharmed and fundamentally changed. She never boarded a plane again. Her biographer, David Ritz, wrote that the incident was so thorough in its effect that even years later, thunder and lightning on the ground, not in the air, simply encountered during ordinary travel by car or bus, could trigger a fear response strong enough to disrupt her day. The phobia, as phobias tend to do when they take root in a genuine traumatic experience, had spread outward from its original source and colonized adjacent territory. It was not simply a reluctance to fly. It was a full reorganization of her relationship with altitude, weather, and the specific vulnerability of being inside a small machine in conditions it could not fully control. She never spoke about it at length if she could avoid it. When asked, she answered briefly and moved on. The facts were simple enough. She did not fly. Everything else about the career would have to arrange itself around that fact.
The logistics of a concert career without air travel are not simple, and Aretha Franklin's team spent the years after 1984 solving them repeatedly and creatively. She traveled by custom tour bus, not a standard industry bus, a bus configured specifically for her, with the amenities and comfort that a performer of her standing required for journeys that, by the nature of ground travel across the continental United States, sometimes lasted many hours. She would perform in New York and drive to Chicago. She would play Detroit on a Thursday and reach Washington by Saturday. She crossed the country by road in the way that touring musicians had crossed it before the age of commercial aviation, at the speed of highways and state lines and the specific American landscape that unfolds at 60 miles per hour in a way it never does from 30,000 feet. She told Time magazine in 2010, when asked whether not flying had damaged her career, that it had not, and offered a perspective that surprised the interviewer. She said, "When I was flying, I never saw the U.S. and what it really looked like. I saw the back of the concert hall, the hotel, and the airport. Now I really see America." It was a characteristic Aretha Franklin answer, gracious, deflecting, finding the gift inside the limitation. Whether she fully believed it is impossible to say from the outside. What is clear is that the limitation was real and its costs were significant. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, the first woman ever to receive that honor. The ceremony was in New York. She did not attend. The reasons were never officially confirmed, but people close to her understood without being told. She could not get there the way she needed to get there, and the alternative was to stay home from the most important night in the history of her profession. In 2012, she was approached about joining the judging panel of American Idol. She was interested, genuinely, according to people close to her. The show would have paid several $1,000,000, but filming required constant travel at a pace that her bus could not match, and the conversations eventually ended without a deal. Mariah Carey, Nicki Minaj, and Keith Urban took the seats instead. The practical consequences of not flying became apparent in ways that accumulated slowly and then all at once. The international touring circuit that artists of her stature were expected to maintain, the European festival dates, the Japanese arena tours, the Australian stadium shows, required crossing oceans. Crossing oceans required planes. The offer was simple and impossible at the same time. Come to us, we will fill any room you care to stand in, and all you have to do is board the aircraft. She could not do it. Her British fans, who had been following her music since Respect and Chain of Fools and the magnificent run of Atlantic singles, waited through the 1970s and the 1980s and into the 1990s for a tour that kept not arriving. Promoters called, fees were discussed, venues were tentatively booked, and then the logistics of getting Aretha Franklin from Detroit to London without putting her on a plane would surface, and the conversations would stall. The English Channel is not crossable by bus. The Atlantic Ocean is not navigable by touring coach. She performed in England only rarely, and the circumstances required creative solutions each time. The fans who saw her there remembered it precisely because it was so uncommon, the Queen of Soul present in a room, which felt like something that might not happen again for a very long time. The stages she never stood on accumulated over the decades: London, Tokyo, Sydney. The international touring circuit that her contemporaries maintained through the 1980s and 1990s and beyond was not available to her. Not because promoters did not want her, they wanted her constantly, offered her fees that reflected exactly how much they wanted her, but because getting there required crossing an ocean, and crossing an ocean required something she had decided in a twin-engine propeller plane over Georgia in 1984 that she would not do again. The buses became, in their own way, a kind of institution. People who worked with Aretha Franklin in the decades after 1984 described the bus journeys as an experience unlike anything else in the touring world. She traveled with her own food. She had specific requirements about rest stops and routes and the temperature inside the bus and the music or the silence that accompanied the miles. She was known to arrive at venues having spent 20 or 30 hours on the road from her previous engagement, and to walk onto the stage and perform as if she had slept in a hotel around the corner. The discipline required to maintain that schedule year after year across the length and breadth of a country that she continued to perform in at a pace that would have exhausted artists half her age is not a small thing. Most people who develop a severe phobia in midlife allow it to constrict their world. Aretha Franklin allowed it to constrict her transportation options and nothing else. She continued to perform. She continued to record. She continued to show up by ground for every engagement she had agreed to fulfill, with a consistency that her industry considered remarkable. In 2015, her bus broke down. The mechanical failure stranded her in the middle of a journey between engagements. Her team arranged alternative ground transportation. She did not consider, even for a moment, boarding a plane instead. She had, in the years before her death, spoken about wanting to overcome the phobia. She told the Irish Independent that she had enrolled in a Fearless Flyer course, a program designed specifically for people with severe aviophobia, using a combination of education about aircraft mechanics and exposure therapy to reduce the fear to a manageable level. Whether she completed the course or whether it produced the result she was looking for, she did not say. She died in August 2018 without having flown again.
What the fear cost her is easier to measure than what it gave her. The international career she might have had, the audiences in Europe and Asia and Australia who would have filled stadiums for her the way they filled stadiums for her American contemporaries, did not materialize in the way it might have.
The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ceremony she should have stood at the center of happened without her. The television opportunities that required movement faster than ground travel allowed went to other people. But there is another way to measure a career, and by that measure, the fear of flying changed almost nothing. Aretha Franklin recorded over 40 studio albums. She charted more than 100 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. She won 18 Grammy Awards, more than any other female artist in the awards history at the time of her death. She performed at presidential inaugurations and memorial services and concert halls and churches and arenas across the width of a country she came to know at ground level, through the windows of a custom bus, in the specific detail that only slow travel reveals. She saw America the way America had once seen itself, from the road, at human speed, through the windshield of something that stayed on the ground. She played every city that a bus could reach and found in most of them audiences who did not need her to have crossed an ocean to understand what her voice meant to them. The fear that arrived on a small plane over Georgia in 1984 was real. Its consequences were real. But Aretha Franklin made the decision at some point that she never precisely identified in any interview, that a career built on the ground was still a career worth building, that the stages she could reach were enough, that the voice did not require altitude to travel. She was right. The voice went everywhere it needed to go. It always did. And sometimes the things that ground us end up being the very things that keep us most fully ourselves. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Let us know in the comments. We'll see you in the next story.